to thank you formally, Dr. Gwendolyn Point, our knowledge keeper on the AFN's Knowledge Keeper Circle for the opening and the blessing this morning, and hope that everyone on the coast there in and around your territory is safe after the storm that happened in BC. So thank you so much for being here with us and providing the opening. And feel free to offer any guiding words throughout this session. We look to your guidance and your expertise. So thank you. I'll just reintroduce the session and myself. And this is a webinar on the right to a healthy environment. And our intention today is to invite folks from Environment and Climate Change Canada and Health Canada to present on a draft right to a healthy environment implementation framework that's being developed to guide work under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. My name is Andrea Lesperance. I'm a senior policy analyst with the Assembly of First Nations Environment Sector. We've been hosting quite a few of these webinars over the last few months because we found that it's a great way to bring information to a wide audience, and really happy to do that here today. I'll just go through a couple of housekeeping items and then we can get started. Like I mentioned, the session is being recorded, mostly for note-taking, but it's great. So we also have been circulating the recordings to everyone registered for the session, even if they haven't been able to make it as a reference. And so the session will be recorded. I'll note that we had over 100 people register, so it really does demonstrate, I think, the keen interest in this subject and the importance for First Nations going forward. There is translation available, and if you go to the bottom of your screen, there's the interpretation button. You can select your desired language. I do believe that the presentations will be primarily in English, and so you're fine to leave it on original audio if you'd like, but if anyone switches to French and would like to listen to English, you can do that as well. There is closed captioning available, and for closed captioning services, you can access that in the links to the chat that are there now. Throughout the presentation from our HCCC and Health Canada colleagues, if anyone has a question, we'd like to use the chat, but I'll read the questions as they come in. So we'll just ask Lori and Rebecca to pause at the end of each slide, and I can ask any questions that are in the chat for translation and the recording as well. We will go to a bit of a discussion after our presentation, and then we could have folks raise their hand and speak to any kind of interventions that they'd like to make at that time. There are materials available for the webinar. So my colleague Sunshine has put the link to the agenda in the chat now. There's a microsite where you can access both the agenda, a backgrounder that we've put together, and the presentation as well that Lori and Rebecca will be speaking to. And so we'll put the links in the chat so everybody online can access those as well. So the purpose of this webinar, so in October, Environment and Climate Change and Canada and Health Canada released a draft implementation framework for a right to healthy environment under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, and Lori and Rebecca will speak a bit more to the context. At the Secretariat have been reviewing the draft and we'll be looking to develop a technical submission and some recommendations for how it can be strengthened or improved for First Nations, or where we think that it's doing a good job as it stands now. So there is an official comment period that ends in November for the general public, but there's additional opportunities for Indigenous audiences to continue dialogue on the implementation framework, and so we'll be taking a bit of an extended timeline to do that. One of the things that we hope to do is just get feedback from folks on those kinds of technical recommendations, and also just reflections on the implementation framework generally and how ECCC and Health Canada are implementing the right to a healthy environment that was recently recognized in federal law for the first time through an amendment to the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. And so with that, we will turn ourselves over to Lori and Rebecca, and we'll also just put a link in the chat to the AFN resolution that mandates our work in this area, so folks can reference it if they'd like to. But I believe Rebecca is going to share her screen, and Lori and Rebecca will introduce themselves and get started on the presentation. Thank you.
All right. Hi, everybody. Just want to confirm you see the screen okay. Looks good. So it's really nice to be here with all of you today, and thank you so much, Dr. Point, for your opening and your song and starting us off in this really good way. My name's Rebecca, and I'm a senior policy analyst on the Health Canada side of our Right to a Healthy Environment team. And I'm coming to you today from my house in Ottawa, which is on the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation. And as Andrea was sort of saying, this project has been co-led between Health Canada and Environment and Climate Change Canada. And so I'll turn quickly to my colleague Lori to introduce herself.
Thanks, Rebecca. And again, thank you for the opportunity to come and meet with you today and give some context and background and start the dialogue on where we can improve this implementation framework. So we're really excited to meet with you today, but hopefully this will be the start of longer term dialogue as well. So as Rebecca mentioned, we've got a presentation. She'll start us off and then I'll do the last part, but please ask questions as we're going. We're happy to answer questions as we're on those slides. So, thank you.
Great. Thank you, Lori. So we thought to sort of start off, we would run through a who, what, where, when, why about the work that we're doing. And so starting off with the why, the reason we're here to talk about the right to healthy environment is because amendments were made to the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, which we normally call CEPA, and you'll see that acronym kind of used throughout the presentation. And so amendments were made to this act to update it for the first time since 1999. And with those amendments, CEPA now says that every person in Canada has the right to a healthy environment as provided under the Act, and that the federal government has a duty to protect this right. It also then required us to develop an implementation framework that will set out how our two departments will be fulfilling this duty to protect the right to healthy environment when administering CEPA. And it gave us a 2-year timeline to be doing this work. So that started in June 2023 when the amendments were passed, and we're working towards publishing the final framework in June of 2025. And then finally, we just wanted to emphasize on the how, that the importance of engagement to the work that we're doing. And we've been doing a lot over the last sort of year and a bit to try and engage with the public, with stakeholders, and of course with Indigenous nations, governments, organizations, and communities. We're glad to be able to be here with you today and continue some of that dialogue. So before we jump into the right to healthy environment, we just wanted to give a little bit of background on the Canadian Environmental Protection Act and what we mean when we talk about the right to healthy environment under CEPA specifically. And this under CEPA part is really important because the right to healthy environment has to be understood within the context of this law. And CEPA is one of the federal government's main laws for protecting the environment and human health from pollution. And you can see on the slide here some of the different areas that CEPA operates in and where CEPA helps address pollution risks for these areas. And so one of the big areas that is a big part of the act and that people would maybe be more familiar with is its role in assessing and managing the risks of chemicals to human health and to the environment. And that includes the authorities to be able to develop enforceable instruments like regulations, but also to put in place voluntary instruments like things of codes of practice and guidelines that set out restrictions on the use, release, and manufacturing of different chemicals if they're found to be pose a risk. But there's lots of other areas too. You can see here on the slide, the transboundary movement of hazardous waste, vehicle and engine emissions, and environmental emergencies. So there's lots of different areas that CEPA works in. But of course, there are many other federal acts that play a role in protecting the environment and human health. and there's shared responsibilities with the provinces and territories and local governments and Indigenous governments in some of these areas. And so one thing we want to be clear on from the start is that this right to healthy environment applies only within the context of decision-making under SEPA. And so that means we won't be talking about things that are covered by some of these other acts that we've put on the slide here, like the Fisheries Act or the Impact Assessment Act. And then finally, we just wanted to say that the SEPA also affirms the commitment to implementing the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, including free, prior, and informed consent. And this is something that we've tried to comment on and reflect throughout the draft framework that we've prepared. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. So keeping that kind of context of SEPA in mind, we wanted to talk about what the draft framework that we've published proposes as the meaning of a right to healthy environment in the context of SEPA. And SEPA already starts off by providing us with a definition of a healthy environment as one that is clean, healthy, and sustainable. And then in the draft framework, we build on this definition by identifying substantive elements of the right. And so this includes the right to live in an environment that is protected from harmful substances, pollutants, and waste, and where actions taken under SEPA contribute to clean and healthy air and water, a sustainable climate, healthy ecosystems, and biodiversity. So in addition to those substantive elements, we've also identified procedural elements of the right. And these are access to information, participation in decision-making, and access to effective remedies in the event of environmental harm. These procedural elements intersect with and support many other elements that we are going to talk about in terms of what's in the framework. And so we'll kind of come back to them in terms of their connections to the principles and the different mechanisms that we have to protect the right. And then the third element that we've included as part of this protecting the right to healthy environment is respect for the rights of Indigenous peoples as critical to protection of the right. And diving into that a little bit more specifically, this includes respect for Section 35 rights, for treaties, and for the Government of Canada's legislative and policy commitments to First Nations, Inuit, and Métis, including through things like the UN Declaration Act Action Plan. And so basically with this, we're trying to say we don't see the right to healthy environment under SEPA as separate from these other obligations and commitments, but that they sort of reinforce each other. And as part of this, we've included in the framework some specific articles from the UN Declaration that are particularly relevant to protection of the environment and human health. And sort of the intention there is so that when people within government are looking at the framework and referring it, using it to implement, they're going to be also seeing and looking and considering their obligations under the UN Declaration. And so we have a dedicated section that talks about Indigenous rights in the context of the framework, but we've also tried to weave the different priorities that we've been hearing from partners and the engagement that we've done so far throughout the framework. Of course, we know that there's probably still many ways that it can be improved, and so sort of emphasizing that what we put out is a draft, and we're really open and interested in hearing your comments and your submissions about how we can better approach this throughout the framework. So now we wanted to turn to a couple of the other areas that SEPA required us to include in the framework, and so the first of these are the principles that we have to elaborate on in the framework. And there are 3 new principles that were added to SEPA. The first of these is environmental justice, which is related to avoiding disproportionate adverse environmental and health impacts and burdens falling on different populations, considering those populations in decision-making and allowing for meaningful involvement of those populations in decision-making under the Act. Then we have intergenerational equity, which emphasizes that it's important to meet the needs of the present generation without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. This, of course, is closely tied to the idea of sustainable development. And then non-regression, which the draft framework proposes, means to prevent reduced levels of environmental and health protections, and where possible, to continuously improve these protections. And so we'll talk a little bit more about how these can be upheld in SEPA decision-making through some of the things that are in the framework in the next few slides. We also wanted to point out that there's a number of existing SEPA principles, which we don't go into detail about in the framework, but which definitely still apply and are part of protecting the right. And so you can see these on the side. There's things like an ecosystem approach, polluter pays, the precautionary principle, pollution prevention, and so on and so forth. And so SEPA programs already have experience with implementing these principles, and they're part of protecting the right. Another element that we were required to elaborate on in the framework are the factors. And these are relevant factors to be considered in interpreting and applying the right, and in determining the reasonable limits to which it's subject. SEPA actually gave us 4 factors: the scientific, health, social, and economic, and we've added a 5th one, environmental. So with the scientific factor, this involves using the best data, evidence, methods, and practices that are available, taking an interdisciplinary approach and looking at the weight of evidence. The environmental factor is described in the framework as including the consideration of the improvement of health of the environment, including ecosystems, biodiversity, vulnerable environments, and cumulative effects. The health factor includes analyzing potential adverse human health impacts of pollution and the benefits of actions that are taken under SEPA. And of course, this again ties into populations who may be disproportionately impacted by that pollution. And we've also included references to things like mental health, which was raised in the comments we had heard up into our work so far, to be able to be considered when there's information available or in terms of how we design communications and outreach material. And then the social factor relates to considering risks and how they differ for different populations based on those different social factors. It can be things like income, gender, education, all those sort of intersectional considerations that would impact the social impacts of the decision. And the economic factor would come into play in looking at the financial and economic returns alongside health, social, environmental, and other relevant costs and benefits, as well as the distribution of these different costs and benefits amongst different groups. And within each of these factors in the framework, we've included the fact that they have to consider Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous rights, and the relevance of relationships that Indigenous peoples have with the land, and sort of the physical, mental, cultural, and spiritual importance of that connection. And so that's part of how we have framed these factors as well in the framework. So in terms of the factors, they have to be considered on a case-by-case basis in SEPA decision-making. So there's not a sort of one-size-fits-all to how they play into decisions. But we tried to give a little bit more detail and elaborate on the types of things that would be considered under each one. So that I'm going to hand over to Lori to talk a little bit more about some of the tools that we have in the framework to consider all of these different elements and walk us through the rest of the presentation.
Thanks, Rebecca. So up until this point, Rebecca's given a really high-level overview of some of the new concepts and considerations and elements that we had to elaborate on within the framework. But what does this really mean in terms of how the government will protect the right to a healthy environment when decisions are being made under this act? And so within the framework, there are 2 groups of what we call mechanisms. And so in Annex 1 of the framework, we have examples of very specific tools, processes, and actions that will be taken, that we're proposing to take, either new or existing or improvements to existing. And those are pretty specific to the different program areas. And then in Annex 2 of the framework, we have, we'll call it a overarching mechanism, and those are guiding considerations that we see being applied by all the various SEPA program areas when they are implementing their programs or making decisions. And so I'll walk through both of these groups of mechanisms, and hopefully it'll become a bit more clear on some of the actions that we have in the framework and what they might mean for better protection and upholding the right. So the next slide, I think we go into the first bucket or the first grouping of mechanisms. And so these are mechanisms, as I mentioned, SEPA stated that we had to elaborate on mechanisms, and we've defined those as tools or policy approaches that the SEPA programs at both Environment Canada and Health Canada either already use or new ideas that we could put into place that would support the protection of the right to healthy environment, but also upholding those new principles that Rebecca went through. So just some of the examples on the slide, we pulled in those that we thought would be the most of interest for this audience and for First Nations. But in the framework, there are many, many more that are listed that we won't go into. But if anyone has interest in discussing those in more detail, we have our contact information at the end of this presentation as well. So just highlight a couple that I will walk through in the next couple of slides are the ability to submit a request to assess a substance. We also have a mechanism that hopefully will enhance the access to remedies, and also the proposal to develop an Indigenous knowledge policy framework for SEPA. And so a couple of those are new, and one of them is already in place. So I'll walk through in the next slide in much more detail the first one, which falls within both departments. So both Environment Canada and Health Canada have obligations to conduct risk assessments on substances that are in use in Canada. So it falls under our existing substances program. And there's a long list of different chemicals that have been assessed over the years by both departments. And once they are assessed and evaluated, if they are determined to be toxic, then we need to take action and put in place one of those tools, either a regulation or a voluntary instrument. But now there is a program and there's an opportunity for anyone in the public to submit a request to Environment and Health Canada to prioritize the assessment of a substance. And so there is a website now where you can go and submit a form requesting that the government consider whether one of the new substances, or sorry, a substance that hasn't been assessed yet, be prioritized by the government. And within this form, there are questions and there's information that must be provided to provide the government with some justification on why we should consider this substance a priority. And some of the information on this form gives an opportunity to highlight, does this substance disproportionately impact a population across the country? Are there cumulative effects that should also be looked at? Or is this substance found within a hotspot across Canada? So a community that's already facing pollution from other chemicals. And all of that will help the government factor that into the criteria and decide on whether it should be identified as a priority to be assessed. And so it's very transparent. On this website, there's a list of all of the substances that had been requested, and then also a requirement for the government to report back on whether this request was accepted or whether it was denied. And so to date, there's been 3 substances that have been submitted through this program. And 2 of the 3 have been accepted, and they will be added to the plan of priorities. That is also out for public comment right now. And somebody will probably ask me, what are those 2 chemicals? And one of them has to do with the oil sands, naphthenic acids, and the other is, I'm only going to say the short form, it's 6-PPD, which is found in tires. And I know that is a concern because it's also ends up in water bodies and fish. So both of those are 2 of the hot topic substances, and both of those came through the assessment or the request for assessment program. So. Yes, Andrea.
Yeah, I just wanted to just note that the request for assessment of the naphthenic acids, how do you say it?
Yes.
Okay. Did come from EcoJustice on behalf of Athabasca Chippewa and First Nation, along with 2 ENGO organizations, Keeper of the Water and Environmental Defense. So just wanted to note, I don't know the details of the request for the substance related to tires, whether that came from a First Nation, but at least one of the three kind of requests for assessments that have come forward so far was on behalf of a First Nation. And so it's interesting to see that precedent being set by communities themselves.
Yes, that's a great segue into how we feel that this new process or this new mechanism can be an example of how it also upholds environmental justice because of the new attention on does this disproportionately impact certain populations and hotspot. And also the access to information and participation in decision making. So having new sources of information and new nations, not new nations, but new partners who maybe traditionally hadn't had a chance to participate in these priority setting exercises are now having that opportunity. So yeah, it's still early days for this program, but we're pretty excited that it's already been used and successful, I think, in at least these two substance situations. So thanks for adding that, Andrea. So that's that for a first example of a mechanism that we've identified in the framework. The next one, we're moving down into the enforcement program of Environment Canada. So already within SEPA, there are a number of ways that the public and nations and stakeholders can get involved in helping identify priorities, I guess, for investigations for enforcement. So the Section 17 of SEPA provides the ability for the public to request that Environment and Climate Change Canada conduct an investigation if they feel that there's environmental damage. And this authority or this remedy, we call it, has been in SEPA since 1999, but it hasn't been used very much. And we feel that there's probably a number of reasons for that. The first one is that there's not any guidance available on how to use this or how to access it. And so one of the first steps is that we're proposing to develop some better guidance for the public and help with the process and help with accessing this remedy. Because we feel that the more people that are aware of it, hopefully there'll be more use of this action or this ability for the public to hold us accountable. And if we do receive a request through this section of SEPA, the minister has an obligation to reply within 20 days, and then also to come back with a decision within 90 days on whether they're going to take action or take an investigation. So again, this helps to promote participation in decision making, also environmental justice and non-regression, so ensuring that we're maintaining enforceability of our regulations under SEPA, and that there's also access to a remedy. So this again links back to some of the concepts that Rebecca had gone over in her part of the presentation. So how some of these mechanisms not only will help protect the right, but will also uphold these new principles. And then the third mechanism that I'll spend more time going over is a proposal that we have introduced in the framework for the development of an Indigenous knowledge framework for SEPA specifically. And of course, we would be looking to collaborate with Indigenous partners on developing this framework. We have included Indigenous knowledge throughout the framework, but we felt that there was also a need internally from our colleagues to better understand within the different SEPA program areas the proper ways to use Indigenous knowledge, how to engage, and also ensuring that we are upholding the CARE principles for Indigenous data governance and as well the First Nation principles of OCAP when using Indigenous knowledge and data. So it's an idea that we are looking for feedback on whether you feel that this would be a helpful tool and how could it work with other existing Indigenous knowledge frameworks that are already out there, And of course, how would it work together with nation-specific? And this would not supersede or overwrite any nation-specific Indigenous knowledge frameworks that are out there, but maybe it could provide a baseline or kind of an overarching framework that would then work together with different geographic locations or nations that have specific knowledge frameworks as well. And I did want to mention that the draft implementation framework does reference some important concepts that were shared by First Nations as well as Métis partners on the discussion document. So before we developed this draft implementation framework, we did publish a discussion document, and we received some great feedback. And so we heard from some of our partners that they would like to see us reference some of these concepts right within our framework. And again, if there are other concepts that nations would want to see reflected in the final framework, this is an opportunity to have those discussions and also submit them during this comment period on the draft framework. So I'll move, oh, Andrea, yes.
I just wanted to ask you to speak maybe a little bit to what mechanisms currently exist within the current iteration of like what we call the SEPA management cycle or SEPA cycle, I guess, of assessment and enforcement. What current mechanisms exist to partner with First Nations to identify Indigenous knowledge that could inform those steps within the SEPA cycle? Are there any that exist currently, and is the proposal to, with the development of an Indigenous knowledge framework, enhance those opportunities so that First Nations could influence the SEPA cycle?
Yeah, that's a great question. And Rebecca, please jump in if you think of anything I can't think of. So within the SEPA cycle, I haven't shown the cycle yet, but it is coming up on a future slide. There's the various program areas, but then in the middle that informs all of those program areas is interjurisdictional cooperation, public participation, and Indigenous engagement or Indigenous consultation. That should be engagement. Thanks, Rebecca, for flipping a few slides ahead. So this is what we call the SEPA cycle, SEPA management cycle. And in the middle, you'll see that this circle touches on all of the program areas, and there are requirements under SEPA to conduct consultation and public engagement as well. Now that it recognizes UNDRIP within the Act, there's also a stronger recognition that Indigenous engagement is also needed to be worked into all of these processes. The problem is there's no consistency, and there's also a lack of knowledge and understanding of how to appropriately engage. And there's also capacity issues, I understand as well, from both Indigenous partners as well as the government. So we're hoping that this framework would build on best practices that some of the program areas might have. So one example I can think of off the top of my head is for the oil and gas sector that conducts a lot of their program areas under risk management. It's like the circle called risk management. They do have a Crown Indigenous working group where they work together on designing and selecting how they'll manage the risks from oil and gas, the sector. And oil sand regulations that are being developed. I know that there's a lot of co-development work that's being discussed at that. And there's also Indigenous engagement activities and opportunities in the National Pollutant Release Inventory. So different program areas are doing different things, but there's a lack of consistent approach. And I think that's one of the benefits that could be seen from having this Indigenous knowledge framework on encouraging programs at a minute, what's the minimum and what are best practices. So Rebecca, did you have anything to add?
Not, I mean, I can give some examples from the Health Canada side as well of work that's been done looking at indoor air quality, for example, and different involvement in terms of developing some of the water quality guidelines and things like that. But I just sort of echo what Laurie's saying about this need for guidance on being more consistent and throughout all of these different stages. So.
And timely as well, because I think
Yeah.
a lot of time things don't happen soon enough, and there's not enough time that's allotted to engagement. I think there's a lot of old ways of doing things that, you know, publish for a 60-day comment period and trying to do engagement within that period, but really maybe engagement needs to be throughout the whole life cycle of an issue that we're trying to manage. And so that's our vision for what this the implementation framework as a whole, but having a separate Indigenous knowledge framework, I think, could also help with that too. All right, thanks, Andrea, for that. So those were the examples of the first type of mechanisms that were in the framework, so very specific to certain program areas at both departments. I wanted to touch on the overarching guiding considerations that we feel that all the program areas within both Environment Canada and Health Canada could use to improve their processes, but also to ensure that they are considering all the factors, considering the principles, and considering those procedural elements on a case-by-case basis, and Indigenous rights as well, when they are making decisions in their program area. So the implementation framework has to be flexible and general enough so that it will apply to all the different various decisions that and authorities that are within this one act. And so we were envisioning this guiding considerations, which is a list of questions in Annex 2 of the draft framework that could be applied on a case-by-case basis in both departments in all the program areas. So I wanted to give an example of how this could work. So the next slide, which I think we were already given you a sneak peek on, but this is SEPA in a nutshell. And these are kind of the different program areas, we call them. And then within each program area, there are decision points that we've identified. So for example, in the research and monitoring program area at both departments, there are priority setting decisions that are happening. There's also designing of studies, there's generating all the knowledge and data, then they're analyzing the data, and then they're reporting and sharing results. So those are kind of the decision points that are made within that program, and we've broken down each of the other program areas. And so we envision this guiding consideration annex questionnaire to be used in each of these areas, and hoping that by doing that, there will be improved access to information, more transparency in the decision making that's happening, as well as better engagement, ensuring that Indigenous rights are considered, ensuring that those three principles are also incorporated within how they're making decisions. So I have a specific example on the next two slides to kind of bring this to life. And we thought we would pick the New Substances program. So under this program, there are two different regulations. One that requires anybody that wants to use a new substance or a new chemical has to notify Environment and Climate Change Canada first. And then there's also the organisms part of this program. So within the Oh, I see a message that the slides aren't being seen anymore.
I'm seeing them. Marianne, can you see the slides? I see you on camera. Rebecca, do you want to just try and flip like down and then back up to make sure that they're transitioning properly?
I can see the slide.
Okay.
Okay, it might
Okay.
just be the one person's screen, but
Yeah, I think it's Trish, did you maybe want to just like refresh and come back online? It might just be that your internet has frozen.
okay. I'll keep going, and hopefully we can answer questions that come up if Trish doesn't get to see them. So as I was saying, there's two two areas to the new substances program, one that focuses on chemicals, the other that focuses on organisms. So both of those regulations ensure that no new chemical or no new living organism is introduced within the Canadian marketplace before it goes through an assessment, so both an ecological and a human health assessment. And if there are concerns, we would go back and ask that organization that wants to start using that chemical or organism to start or to provide evidence or science or information to ensure that it would not have a negative impact on the environment or human health. So there's a notification process that happens, and the risk assessment program within the new substances group would assess the data that's received and would ensure that there's no potential to cause any adverse environmental impacts to the biodiversity or prevent potential effects to the general population, or as it linked back to environmental justice, ensuring that it doesn't disproportionately impact certain populations within the country. So using some of the guiding considerations, making sure that these summaries of notifications that are seen or that are received, are posted online. So ensuring that people have an opportunity to see the notifications as well as all the supporting information. And then stakeholders are invited to input more scientific information or test data that they might have on this proposal or on this notification before any decision is made. And then once a decision is made, closing the loop and providing responses back to the public and ensuring that those are transparent and posted so that other people can see what the final decision was made. So kind of supporting that, ensuring that participation in decision making is front and center, but also making sure that there's transparency in those decisions. So can I just, before I saw that question come up, Andrea, can I just do the last part and then it
Absolutely.
kind of goes into that question? So if it, oh, sorry, Rebecca, no, sorry, the last part of that slide, thanks. So if we did think that there was a suspicion of toxicity or it would have a negative impact, then the request wouldn't be approved, but it could be approved with conditions. And so we could put a notice, it's called a significant new activity notice, or put an order that the company could use this new organism or this new chemical, but it would be subject to the requirements that are set out in those control measures. And those control measures are enforceable. So if somebody is granted the approval to use said organism or chemical and they did not follow the requirements that are in those orders, then enforcement could take action on that. And I just wanted to double check if that answered the question specifically, or if there was more nuance to that.
Lenore, what did you were you looking for any additional information on the penalty? You can put it in the chat, or if you wanted to unmute and speak to the question.
Good morning. Yeah, I just wanted to know, like, if somebody was breaching these, like, what it actually is, like, the typical penalty. Is it like, $5,000 and blah blah blah? Is it like, I don't know, just so that I have level of accountability to what this work is doing. Hi, Chika.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. So it's kind of a scale, and it depends on precedents and previous non-compliance, but there is a criteria document that outlines all the consideration or all the criteria and how much that could be added to a fine. So under SEPA, it's called administrative monetary penalties. So it would allow an enforcement officer to issue fines, and this document will outline how much. And it is, I think, up to 25,000, but they can be compounded. So if there are multiple breaches by the same person or same company, you can add on to those fines. And that's just what an enforcement officer can issue themselves. If it was a bigger violation, then it would go through the court process, and the court would determine the fines, again, depending on the severity of the environmental or human health damage. And there is an environmental offenders database that we could also provide in the notes after that outlines what some of the examples of the fines are. Some of those have been like 300,000. I think it's up to $1 million that could be fined under SEPA, a SEPA violation. So again, it depends on a number of different criteria and factors. Great.
Thanks, Lori.
Thank you.
I just wanted to see if maybe afterwards we can circulate to folks links to the places where they can find summaries of like open consultations for new living organisms. Like I'll just note that we've heard concern about genetically modified organisms, and these are the regulations and the program that does regulate GMOs. And so there will note for folks that at certain points, if there's an application to use a genetically modified organism within the country, it triggers requirements under SEPA and the new substances notification regulations. And it's in the past has been really difficult to find information online about what's being proposed in order for folks who are concerned to submit those concerns. I understand that there's a new initiative to make sure that that information is more publicly available, including higher level summaries as well. I'm just looking at the link that I was able to find now. It says there's currently no open consultations for any one like genetically modified organism, but in the past, this program has reviewed and approved the use of genetically modified fish. So that's the key example that we've seen kind of go through the SEPA process in the past that perhaps First Nations didn't necessarily have the information about or the ability to register concerns about, just because the information that has been publicly available in the past is quite opaque and difficult to find.
You're doing great at setting up my next slides for me, Andrea.
I didn't even mean to.
I know,
Okay,
we didn't plan this at all, but so this is how the program works now, but how we want to see the implementation framework on the Right to Healthy Environment change some of the way we do things is by requiring all the programs under SEPA to consider these guiding considerations and improve and to address exactly some of the things that Andrea highlighted. So using the guiding considerations for the new substances notification reg and the program, they should be looking at how can they make public information more accessible, especially for communities and populations that haven't traditionally been in the process as frequently or maybe not as knowledgeable about these processes, and ensuring that the information is translated and it's also in a format that's suitable for all the different audiences. Also identifying and considering how populations who might be disproportionately impacted by that decision. It says pollution here, but it could also be by these decisions to approve genetically modified organisms, and how the distribution of the risks might be different according to different lived experiences and locations across Canada as well. And also, can they look at using best available science and evidence, and this should include Indigenous knowledge. So are they using it enough right now? Probably not, but how can they, considering these guiding considerations, make those improvements to their program and start integrating Indigenous knowledge when they're reviewing these notifications for new organisms? And also ensuring that they're applying some of those other principles that Rebecca mentioned, not just the new ones, but the existing ones. So how does the precautionary principle play into those decisions that they're making? And I already mentioned ensuring Indigenous knowledge, but making sure that it's protected in accordance with the principles and the requirements by the law, and providing better meaningful engagement, distinction-based, and engaging with Indigenous partners early in the process and throughout the process, and also reporting back on how their input was considered. So not just a publishing a response to comments, but making the effort to go back specifically and explaining how their input was considered, and if it wasn't able to be considered, why not? And then ensuring that decisions are promoting reconciliation, mutual respect, and understanding to advance the UN Declaration Act. So all the programs in both departments that work under SEPA would have these guiding considerations, and this was just one example of the New Substances program on how, once this framework is published, that they should be incorporating these principles and into their processes and looking at things differently. So that is our hope on how this will promote change and improve how we're making decisions. The next slide, I believe, is the wrap-up slide. So that was a lot of information that we presented on what the framework could mean and how we've proposed some of the definitions of the principles and the factors and the procedural elements. You'll see that we are well into the engagement and the development of this framework. The public comment period on this draft implementation framework ends on December 4th. However, we have extended comment period and engagement period for Indigenous partners and First Nations, and that would be January 6th. We recognize that that is even short as well. However, we're working towards that 2-year timeline that the Act has given to us, and that would have us publishing in June of 2025 next year, the final implementation framework. And I say final, however, it'll be the final of this version, but we envision that we will learn a lot as we start implementing this framework. And we would hope that we would continuously improve it based on areas that we're learning as we're implementing it. So we have included our email address, and we're happy to have additional conversations if there are nations that are more interested in having in-depth conversation on this, and also a link to our website that you'll find some more information, and a link to the draft framework, which I think has already been provided in the chat. But we can also, as Andrea suggested, provide a bunch of links that we can share afterwards with some of the participants as well. So with that, I think if there are other questions, we're happy to answer questions, but we also have some discussion topics as well. So.
Oh, that's great. Are there any questions that folks wanted to ask at this point before we kind of pose a couple discussion questions to the group and hope to get your reflections on? Clarifying kind of questions about the draft implementation framework, or perhaps the right as it's recognized in SEPA itself. Feel free to put them in the chat, or if you wanted to raise your hand, maybe we'll just give folks a couple minutes to reflect on what they've heard and see if there's anything that they wanted to ask at this point. I will say too that the process to recognize the right itself in SEPA has been ongoing since I believe, and maybe you could let me know if I'm wrong, since like 2017-ish, there was the initial expert panel. Is that right, Lori?
There's been talk about adding the right to healthy environment into SEPA even before that, like in the early 2000s, but officially within the parliamentary process, yes, 2017 or 2016, I think.
Okay. And it's our understanding that this is the first time that a right to healthy environment has been recognized in Canadian federal law. So quite significant, but as you noted, like limited to the SEPA context, and so not necessarily like the constitutional level of rights that some folks had been hoping for, but good to see progress regardless. Lenore had another question in the chat. Does the team have a timeline of engagement session recordings? And I think you had done some external outreach and information sessions. So can you just maybe speak to what's ongoing in terms of engagement and whether it's available to folks online?
Sure. I think you're referring to the webinar that we did earlier this month. There was like broader audience, and those recordings went out. So if somebody didn't receive them, please send us an email. Like, we did send them out to all of those that participated. So if you didn't get that email, we're happy to send them out.
Yeah, I think I don't know that everyone here would have been aware, but the team here from ECCC and Health Canada hosted an information session for a general audience on the draft implementation framework and gave a similar presentation earlier in the month. And this is kind of our specific targeted presentation to the audience that we've advertised to. But yes, the recording for the previous session is available, and perhaps we can circulate that as well too. Similar information presented, but just maybe some additional questions asked by the audience at that point. Rebecca, did you want to speak to that?
I was just going to say it's not a recording, but along with the draft implementation framework that we published, we also had published a What We Heard report based on all of the engagement we did on our discussion document. And so like the ideas that were in the discussion document have evolved, and I'd say it's not as current as the draft implementation framework. It's not as valuable to spend time looking at that, but certainly the What We Heard report can show you some of the themes that we've already been hearing and that we've tried to reflect in our draft implementation framework if that's of interest to folks. Oh, thanks, Sunshine. I see you put it in the chat.
Yeah, and I was going to note for folks that we have been talking about kind of the long history of the recognition of the right, but then the team here from ECCC and Health Canada had released a discussion paper for comment in a kind of previous iteration of the engagement process leading up to development of this draft framework. And I think that's the What We Heard document that Sunshine put in the chat was what we heard and what they heard in reference to that discussion paper that was previously put out. Could you remind us, Lori and Rebecca, had there been funding available to provide capacity supports for communities to review that discussion paper and exactly what the timeline was?
Yep, there was a moderate amount of funding, or I should say modest, not moderate, modest amount of funding that when we initially reached out to organizations, regional, national, as well as rights holder or modern treaty holders, we sent emails out at the beginning of or before the publication of the discussion document. So October of 2023, we started outreach, and those nations that had expressed an interest in leading engagement or seeking funding, we were able to fund all of those that had reached out to us. And so we've got about 24 different organizations, as well as some nations that received funding and that are conducting engagement activities within their nations and communities and within their populations as well. So, but the funding we've got, I think it's mostly allocated at this point. There might be room for one or two nations that are really keenly interested in doing something specific on the right to healthy environment that we'd be happy to have a conversation with really soon, but getting the funding out before January would be very difficult at this point.
Okay. And there's a couple of questions in the chat, but maybe after we address those, we can talk a little bit about the kind of related and ongoing work of the developing the environmental justice strategy, because that's related, and I understand there might be additional opportunities for funding available to review information related to that kind of peripherally related subject as well. But the question, Yeah, the questions in the chat were, so what are the next steps? So we talked a little bit about the history, the development of the framework, what comes, or the development of the draft framework, what comes next, and if you wanted to speak to the timeline, and then the next question is about how this relates to provincial laws. So I can read that one after.
Yeah, I saw that one too. The next steps are our public comment period ends in 2 weeks, 2 weeks yesterday, and so we're finishing up with a few more engagement presentations next week and a visit to a nation next week as well to do some engagement. And we're hoping that we'll receive comments from stakeholders and the general public by December 4th. But then, as mentioned, we have a longer extended comment period for Indigenous organizations and as well as nations. That would be January 6th. Recognizing I know a lot are closed down over the holidays, so there might be a little wiggle room or a week or two after that. However, we have to turn this around, and once we received all the comments, consider how we will incorporate them into the final framework and then go through approvals process again to publish in June of 2025. So we've got, after the comment periods end, about 6 months to finalize the framework. And then we'll be implementing the framework. And there's also an obligation, which we never mentioned, but there's a reporting requirement. So once the framework is in place, we need to report every year on how it's being implemented, and that will be in the SEPA annual reports. And we will also be publishing a portal, a Right to Healthy Environment portal, that will hopefully provide better information about how people can learn about their right to healthy environment under SEPA and understand these program areas as well as opportunities to get involved better. So we're hoping to have that published as well in June of 2025. And when we publish the final framework, there will be a what we heard, but also how comments were incorporated kind of summary that is also published at the same time.
And then is there a place, sorry if I could just
No, go ahead.
interrupt you. Is there a place to send your comments? Do we just send them to that email you provided?
Yes, that's right. Yep, that healthy environment email is the place to
Awesome.
submit them. Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you.
A couple of follow-up questions just on process, and then maybe we can go to the provincial law subject. So what's the mechanism for publication of the final framework? Does it just get published on ECCC's website, or is it submitted to the minister or cabinet? And the second question is, in the annual reporting, is there an opportunity for First Nations or First Nation organizations to provide input to the annual report in the legislated requirement or any of the kind of policy commitments made in policy?
All right, I'll try and cover everything that I can remember in that question. So how will it be published? It'll just be published on the SEPA registry, which is the website that everything under SEPA gets published on. And it does require the approval of the ministers, so both Environment Canada Minister and Health Canada Minister, but it doesn't need to go to Cabinet or back to Parliament. It doesn't need to be tabled in Parliament. We did publish a notice, like a Canada Gazette short notice informing people of the draft framework. It still hasn't been determined if we would do that for the final framework, but the framework itself will be published just on a website. And then we will also do email notification to all the people that have been involved in the engagement for the last 2 years on the framework. We'll send out an email notifying everybody when it's published. And the annual reporting. So that part of your question, it's a good suggestion. There's no legislative requirement to consult on a draft annual report. It's a requirement for the department to table it at Parliament. So the minister actually has to take the SEPA annual report to Parliament. And we have not in the past consulted on it or had other people input into it, but I think that would be a really interesting suggestion or an idea to consider.
Thank you. Rebecca, did you want to speak to the annual reporting? And then there's 2 questions in the chat I can read now.
Yeah, I was just going to say on the annual report, there was, with all the amendments that were made, and then a new requirement put in that throughout the annual report, there has to be more reporting on what the programs are doing in terms of Indigenous engagement. And so again, we were saying in practice, it's not necessarily been very consistent, but having that reporting obligation is maybe another factor that will encourage the programs to make sure they're doing concrete things. And so I guess anyone who would be involved in those program-specific activities, if those are represented in the report, might have a bit of a view into that. So the reports are always sort of for a fiscal year, and it's always a bit like late, I guess, that they get out. So the timelines don't always work out super quickly, but it's still a really good resource for learning about sort of what's been going on with SEPA programs.
Thank you. So I'll read the question in the chat for translation and the closed captioning. So how does this relate to provincial laws? For example, if a province has no policy or legislation for a right to healthy environment, can the federal law override that? How would that play out in the courts or be addressed in the courts? What is the difference if it's not on the constitutional level?
So thank you for that question. No, you're correct. There are no provincial laws that have a right to, well, I shouldn't say no. I think Ontario has a Bill of Rights as well.
Bill of Rights.
Yeah, Bill of Rights. And there are a couple of other provinces that have elements of the right to healthy environment, but this right to healthy environment does not apply to provincial regulations. It's only on actions that we take under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. And so as the question alludes to, there's a constitutional, jurisdictional divide between protecting the environment at a federal level and a provincial level. And federally, we wouldn't be able to step in and put in anything that would apply just to a province for this right to a healthy environment.
Nicole, I see your hand up. Did you want to raise an additional point in relation to that question?
Yeah, just so I understand, I'm the one who asked the question to begin with. Just so I understand, so does that mean like the right to healthy environment would only be over federal lands like national parks, but if land was provincially administered, then the province, didn't necessarily have to abide by the right to a healthy environment? Is that what I'm hearing?
Sort of. So SEPA, this Canadian Environmental Protection Act, it really regulates chemical use. And so like in industries or different manufacturing sectors or resource extraction industries such as oil and gas for chemicals. And so it would apply to a industry that's on provincial land, but it's only when there's a regulation put in place under this act that that the right to healthy environment would kick in or that would apply. So it's.
And I'll just add, I think it's my understanding that it would apply to decisions made under SEPA, which are the kind of chemical and pollution management decisions, as opposed to, say, for example, the province in many cases regulates wildlife, right? So the rights to a healthy environment doesn't necessarily cover decisions made by the province in relation to wildlife management or corresponding hunting rights. So it's limited to kind of ensuring that decisions made related to chemicals and other pollutant like issues are addressed in a manner aligned with the recognition of the right.
Yep, that's correct. And so by regulating those chemicals, it would hopefully have a positive benefit on wildlife or on land, but we don't directly through this act regulate land or species or wildlife.
That clarifies it. Thank you so much for explaining it that way.
You're welcome. And the difference of it not being in the Constitution or the Charter is that it's a one act at a time type of approach. And so there's nothing stopping the the government from deciding to add it to other acts in the future. But right now, it's just the one, as opposed to if it was in the charter, then it would kind of apply much more broad as a human right.
Thank you. There's one question in the chat. Nicole, I see your hand is still up. Did you want to add anything to that, or legacy hands? Okay, it's done. Just want to make sure. So Stephanie put in the chat, how is the framework going to implement UNDRIP and FPIC?
That's a good question. Rebecca, do you have some thoughts to kick us off while I'm thinking?
Sure. Yeah. I think we're trying to see them, I guess, as sort of mutually reinforcing, and that a lot of the things that we're putting in the framework will be consistent with the government's obligations under UNDRIP. And so, you know, seeing those connections between some of the things that we're talking about in our framework with access to information and free, prior, and informed consent, and those specific activities, it can be difficult to talk about because there's so many different programs and areas of activity under SEPA, and so each one of those programs will be doing slightly different things, but they all play a role in this protection of the environment and human health, and in supporting I guess the UNDRIP articles that pertain to those areas. So it's a bit of a sort of global answer. I don't know if that helps, or Flora, you have any further comments on that? But
yeah, it's hard because it's a framework, and it's a framework that outlines how decisions will be made or how decisions need to consider the right. So I see the really implementation being in the actual actions that we do by following the framework. So it would be taking action to regulate and ensuring that during the development of that regulation or the decision to regulate, we follow the UNDRIP and free, prior, informed consent. So it's hard to envision it within a framework document per se.
I'll just add two. So you had showed the kind of wheel and diagram of the SEPA kind of management and decision-making cycle, with in the middle indicating that there's throughout like different programs, assessments and decision-making requirements for Indigenous consultation. And so we know where like it's like big C consultation, the duty to consult is triggered, that there's a requirement to consult, and UNDRIP does specifically reference consultation towards free, prior, and informed consent, and that specific kind of minimum standard isn't necessarily what's been established in Canadian case law. We talk about consultation and accommodation, but I do know that there's an ongoing effort to update guidelines for federal departments in consultation, in line with, I think it's updated guidelines for federal officials to fulfill the duty to consult. And I do believe that those are undergoing an analysis and process for updating to be aligned with the minimum standards articulated in UNDRIP. So I'd maybe encourage everyone on the line, if you haven't necessarily been involved in or are aware of that kind of ongoing policy update, to I'm not going to say Google it, we can circulate information afterwards, but it's not our environment sector that's leading on those updated guidelines for consultation at the AFN Secretariat. So we could do a little bit of work to get folks on the line some information about that as well. I'll just say too, in the chat, Laura had reflected on the Quebec. In Quebec, the Charter of Human Rights and Freedoms guarantees the right to a healthy environment. And I like things like the Bill of Rights in Ontario, I think, have been used to varying success to ensure that folks who feel like their environmental rights are being disregarded or not respected, there are certain mechanisms to have those addressed, but I think, like I said, to varying success, and I'm not sure if there are First Nations with experience in those kinds of like provincial bills of rights or charters of rights and how they've been particularly effective in influencing decisions at the provincial level. Are there any other questions that folks wanted to ask at this point? Or maybe Lori or Rebecca, did you have any like general reflections based on kind of the conversation so far that you haven't been able to share yet?
Generally, I really appreciate all these great questions, and I really hope that some of the suggestions that we've been hearing that we'll be able to address and improve the implementation framework for the final version of it. And yeah, we think through these conversations and trying to bring it to life, it helps us see where some of the gaps are and where some of the areas that we can improve on. And also, you had mentioned linkages with the environmental justice strategy work that's also being done. So yes, there was another act that was passed that I can never remember the full name of it, but it is addressing environmental racism and achieving or working towards environmental justice. And it requires a study to be conducted on environmental racism in Canada, and also a strategy on how environmental justice will be advanced. And we were working closely with the team that's developing that, but they're on a year, thank you for the full name, yep. They're working on a year behind us, so a different timeline than we are. So they're just starting, and they're doing some initial outreach and setting up some engagement opportunities. And I know that they really want to take a grassroots and nation approach to this strategy. And so I think, Andrea, you're also working closely with that team as well. And there was a webinar a couple of weeks ago on environmental justice. But because we have a timeline before that strategy is in place, we're kind of doing initial engagement on what environmental justice means within the SEPA context, and then making sure that it aligns with what that strategy would also be defining or explaining what environmental justice means within a broader Canadian context. But we're definitely, anything that we receive through our engagement, we're sharing with that team as well. So hopefully anything that is useful for both initiatives. It's not duplicating efforts, but recognizing that it's a different scope, and that national strategy is beyond one act, and it's also beyond one department. It is government Canada-wide. So much bigger scope.
Absolutely. There's a question from Stephanie in the chat, and maybe just before I'll read that one, you had mentioned that you're kind of planning on going to a community to do a similar presentation to this. If folks on the line are interested in kind of bringing you to their First Nation or speak to their organization in the next few weeks to months finalizing the framework, are you open to that?
We're definitely open to having conversations and seeing what can be done. We've limited travel budget, but definitely if people are open to virtual conversations. I know it's always preferable that we're in person, but we've been working to get this visit sorted out for several months. So yeah, definitely keen and interested in talking to as many communities as we would be able to. And in terms of the plan to support nations to actively participate in the development of the framework, as I mentioned, there's a little bit of funding and a little bit of time to help support some communities that it might align with their priorities. But also, once this implementation framework is in place, we're hoping that we would continue relationships and building on what we're learning and how can we improve the framework as it goes. And so we are looking not just to end engagement as of June 2025, but in terms of any commitments, we'd have to have a conversation one-on-one, I think, to work out what makes the most sense and how each different community or nation would like to be engaged. happy to
Mhm.
have those continued conversations. And I
Great.
recognize a few nations that we're already working with on this webinar, so I'm happy to see them here today too.
Nice. Just for the translation and the closed captioning, I'll read Stephanie's question in the chat, and I think there's a part 2 that maybe you could speak to as well. So what's the plan to support First Nations to actively participate in the framework? Many communities need the ethical space and capacity to develop community-led environmental management, monitoring, laws, etc. And also, does the framework include First Nations community laws, bylaws, etc.? So maybe I don't know that we've addressed the like First Nations own laws piece.
Yeah, no, it wouldn't include those laws. Like we mentioned before, that this is a framework to give some set out how the right to healthy environment will be protected when we're making decisions under SEPA. So there might be, as we're doing engagement or working on making decisions under SEPA, that we might need to be aware of other laws, but this right only applies to SEPA, and so we're not referencing any other laws outside of this one law within that framework. And the obligation, just to go back to it, what the Act actually says is the obligation and the duty is on the government to protect the right. And so the framework really takes that lens on, what can you expect the government to do in order to uphold and protect this right for you?
Maybe barring any other questions in the chat, and feel free if you wanted to put more in, but we've got about 30 minutes together. One of the things that we were hoping to do is kind of pose 1 or 2 discussion questions to the group. I'd like to focus, if we can, on the proposal that the Right to Healthy Environment implementation framework includes the development of an additional Indigenous knowledge policy framework. So I'm going to put kind of a question in the chat for folks to mull about, but I'll also read it as well. So the full question for participants, if you're willing to kind of intervene, is the draft Right to a Healthy Environment implementation framework proposes the development of an Indigenous knowledge policy framework for ECCC and Health Canada decision makers, working with Indigenous partners that would guide them in how to approach bridging, braiding, and weaving Indigenous knowledge with Western science in their work with SEPA. And I'm realizing that that's not necessarily a full question. So I think the question and part 2 was whether you support, I think, this proposal that there be an additional Indigenous knowledge policy framework that is developed on a kind of a separate timeline to the draft implementation framework. And Lori or Rebecca, did you want to speak to like the timeline of the requirements for the development of the framework versus the Indigenous knowledge policy framework?
Sure. So I guess my answer is it depends. It's
Mhm.
hard to say until we get feedback through this proposal and this draft implementation framework on whether the partners think it's a good idea, whether what form it takes. It really will kind of be dependent on what we hear back. But it definitely would not be started until the draft implementation framework is published. So I think some initial conversations, if we hear back that everybody thinks it's a good idea and we find out who is interested in getting involved and how and what support would be needed for that, like I think the first part of 2025 would be putting that work plan in place with partners. And ideally, we'd want to have this framework in place relatively soon after the draft framework, or sorry, the implementation framework. There's too many frameworks. The implementation framework is because we would want programs at both departments to start integrating Indigenous knowledge as soon as they could, but we also wouldn't want to rush the process. So I know that's not a great answer, but I think It depends on what we hear, depends on who's interested in being involved, depends on the work plan that the group comes up with, and if capacity support is needed as well, looking for funding to help support participation in that as well.
Lenore has a comment in the chat and I'll read it. And Lenore, feel free to speak up if you wanted to, and then we'll go to Rebecca. So I've worked on that with another project. It was a supplement when that provides our interpretation and what implementation looks like. Rebecca, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, and actually maybe it connects a little bit with Lenore's comment too, of just like we recognize that there are other frameworks that have been worked on that have been developed by nations for themselves, or that have been developed by maybe in partnership with other government departments. And so we're very open to having things that are already out there shared with us so that we can learn from those. And we're doing, already some thinking and digging and noting about things that we're seeing, which doesn't replace the need for that partnership in developing it, but just sort of acknowledging that this is probably a request you've maybe heard before, and we really want to make this targeted to the SEPA context to make it directly useful to the people who are working in our programs and give them that guidance and direction on how to approach Indigenous knowledge in good ways and in more consistent and thorough ways throughout all the different things that they're doing.
Thank you. I'll just pose for folks' consideration too. Like, I'm wondering what's the alternative. So the draft implementation framework has proposed, okay, we'll develop an Indigenous knowledge policy framework because we recognize that there's not necessarily a consistent approach for our programs to incorporate Indigenous knowledge into assessment and decision making. Is the risk in not having one specific kind of guiding framework that sets out how folks are to engage with Indigenous knowledge, that the status quo remains, and that the approach is inconsistent and we don't think that's acceptable, or is the alternative perhaps having the draft implementation framework itself just say something like, and we will respect communities' own Indigenous knowledge community protocols. I'm just wondering kind of what the other options are for folks to kind of mull how they feel about the development of another Indigenous knowledge policy framework. Don't be shy. If anyone wants to speak to the question in the chat, or just raise your hand and speak to it, we're happy to hear any interventions that folks would like to share at this point. If we don't necessarily have strong feelings about the Indigenous knowledge framework that we're looking to share right now, we did want to ask folks about kind of barriers to access to information, and I've kind of raised that throughout the kind of questions to Lori and Rebecca while the presentation was ongoing. So maybe we'll just take one more second to pause on the Indigenous knowledge framework. I'm sorry, Kirby. I see that the connection was spotty. What was the question? So just folks' reflection, I think, on whether an Indigenous knowledge policy framework would add kind of value, and whether we think that that is something that should go ahead as kind of a supplement or an additional piece to the draft implementation framework, recognizing that there's not necessarily a consistent approach for ECCC or Health Canada in assessing risk or making decisions under SEPA to incorporate Indigenous knowledge at this point. Yeah, Kirby said, I don't see why it wouldn't add value. So thank you for that, Kirby. I see Stephanie's hand and Lenore's hand. So maybe we'll go to Stephanie first and then Lenore.
Thanks, Andrea. I see it as adding value. However, I'm curious to know how Indigenous knowledges, who would be behind implementing them to ensure that it's not a checkbox approach.
sorry, trying to get my mouse back to to the audio thing. I think the idea, part of the idea behind this is that SEPA is a really big program, and so there's lots of people in government, and there's going to be people, you know, as public servants, we all now have training and are learning and being educated and being open to the obligations that we have and the other ways of knowing that exist out there to varying degrees. But it's always going to vary person by person. And so I think the idea behind the framework is trying to give better direction on how to make it not a checkbox exercise, and sort of say, like, you can't just read an article and say, oh, they mentioned this concept here and I'm going to use that, and that's kind of check, I've done my Indigenous knowledge piece. But that it's really understanding the full context of that. It's connecting with communities who are the holders of that knowledge, and you know, things like that, to try and encourage people, because we're just finding internally people are saying, we recognize this is important, but where do we don't even necessarily always know where to start. And of course, you know, recognizing, I think this was in some of the questions too, the need for capacity in terms of all sorts of types of like skills and resources, but in terms of funding as well. And that's not always available, but how can programs start building the tools that they need to be able to offer that capacity and be able to be prepared for the types of engagements that would be required to really be able to have this engagement with Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous knowledge holders in like a real way that's not just checking a box.
Thanks, Rebecca. Lori, did you want to add to answer Stephanie's question before we went to Lenore?
No, I think Rebecca really covered it. My concern is if we don't have this framework, then or this Indigenous knowledge framework, then it becomes a checkbox. So the risk is kind of, without it, will they just use the guiding considerations in the framework and just check it off without having that supplemental considerations and knowledge or explanations and education?
Thank you. We'll go to Lenore.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, I've actually seen a couple of ways, like where, you know, an expression of interest goes out where, you know, people that want to be that Indigenous voice working on like a supplementary response. And then I've also seen one where it was a little more distinct to a nation. And with both options, I think they're nothing but positive, because when you're having such diversity on the first group from the Indigenous perspective, you can really gain a lot of knowledge from other communities' lived experiences, and how they've you know shortcut this, or they've done that, or you know they've experienced this and how they resolve that. And then with the other one, it was more distinct, where you're able to really basically assert your sovereignty and title and rights. And I just think that both options are really positive, and I think that it also kind of sets the precedence for our contributions and how we expect that to look. But also, even in the report writing, you're able to really delve into each aspect of it, and again interpret and use your own language and worldviews when you're determining what a matriarch is, what a governing body is, what environmental health actually is from a guardian and stewardship stance, but also from our natural land stewards perspectives as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Lenore. Lawyer Rebecca, did you want to respond to Lenore before we go to Dr. Point?
I just wanted to say thank you, Lenore. I like the idea of an expression of interest, but just making sure we want to allow for whoever really is interested in participating and making sure that as many voices as possible. So again, it would also be something to consider. Do we have a First Nation focused knowledge, and then Métis and Inuit? Like, recognizing even just within the First Nations, there's so much specialty and difference. So yeah, lots to think about and to feedback to the team that is considering developing this framework.
Thank you. We'll go to Dr. Point, and then there's one question and one comment in the chat. But over to you, Knowledge Keeper.
I think it's important, this discussion, and I always say it's this notion of let's a mod, let's a thou, bringing everybody together. Everybody knows the same information, and I'll defer back to the leaders and the Assembly of First Nations, right? They're just looking at it again, environmental health protection, environmental justice, right? And they reference, of course, United Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People. And I agree with the previous speakers as well, the ones that said that it will add value. And I don't think, given what the leaders want, that this can move forward without some sort of framework, something that outlines how is it you're going to work with the local First Nations. I've sat on a lot of different groups, whether it's education, whether it's justice, and certainly the notion that no longer can you do this work without First Nations, right? And that's the key message we want governments to have. If you don't say anything else, right? You don't look left, you don't look right, without making this connection. And I think the work that was done in this framework is a good example. But sitting with the Knowledge Keepers for the last few years, and I was considered the youngest one for a long time. They were 80, late 80s, and might even had one that was 90 years old. And what they really, the key message is same as our leaders, not free, prior, informed consent. And the other is, what if I've learned anything, is regardless of what you do, if you're in BC, you turn to BC. If you're in Stalo territory, that's who you look to, is the Stalo leaders, Stalo people. If you're in Yukon, you turn to the Yukon. So if that somehow is implemented, it's always whatever region you're in. But the framework itself is fine. There's some things you can say and some things you can't, right? In education, I had elders come to the local university and say, are you teaching about our ceremonies and talking about it? And no, we're not teaching about our ceremonies and talking about it, but we are saying we have our own ways of prayer. We have ceremonies, right? Those there are things that you don't, in other words, I'm saying there are things you don't talk about, right? But this is so important. It's so important, and is a good example of what you can do and what you cannot do. And I think if it's clearly spelled out who's doing what, and I'm glad you made the point of saying, that this largely, it looks on, if you say it again, new substances, protecting the environment from people dumping substances, seeing that far too often, especially in our home communities. We still have examples up until even 2 years ago where people will come and dump their garbage, thinking that the other side of the road is the reserve, right? So they're not afraid to come and dump their garbage. or there's a little access road and they come and dump all their garbage because it's on reserve. Oh, it's just a reserve, right? So understanding how important this is, because we come from an oral tradition and we honor that. But the larger society relies on the written word. If it's in writing, they have to abide by it. And if it's gone through government, it makes it law. And that's what we need. We need to be able to say, I'm going to show you this document. and they understand that. So this working relationship, and the work that's been done and the work that's going to be done is so important. And by no means is it perfect, but we have to start somewhere. We have to have this foundation, and the ongoing relationship. Right at the beginning, my hand was going to go up, but I wanted to listen to the whole session. I was wondering, how many First Nations do you have working with you in your areas? And I'm talking to both Rebecca and Lori. Sorry for using your first names, but right. Because I'm a believer that until we're involved on every level across the agencies and governments, that's a difference maker. It just is. So my comments and my question.
Thank you, and I take your comments and your reflections to heart as well. We're doing the best that we can, and I know we have a long way to go and a lot to learn, but I really am thankful to hear your encouraging words. Thank you very much. But in terms of your question on how many First Nations are we working with directly on this particular initiative, not enough. And we did our best to reach out to as many that we could at the start and throughout the process. But as I hope I've made clear, we don't want it just to be on this implementation framework, and then in June, once it's published, it's done. So we're hoping that we keep building more relationships and work with more and more nations, and it won't be over once this is published. And
I think I apologize. My question was, do you have First Nations working in your office?
Oh, in my office.
Oh,
sorry.
Wow.
I misunderstood. My apologies. On this particular file, no, but we are working closely, as I mentioned, with the team on the environmental justice file, and the majority of them are First Nation as well, Métis, and I do see more and more First Nation and Indigenous people joining the government and working internal and also in senior positions as well. So up in the more executive levels, I'm seeing them joining the federal government as well too. So it's changing and it's so important. Yes.
Yeah, and maybe I'll say, like within both of our departments, there are offices that specifically support like anyone working within our departments on Indigenous engagement, and on they organize a lot of the sort of big bilateral meetings that will happen between the government and organizations like the AFN, and so we also meet with them regularly and get advice from them. And I think often in those offices there'll be people who are First Nations too. So it's not it's definitely still not perfect, but we try to find the different people to speak with within our own sort of context of the federal government and our departments to try and get as many perspectives and advice as we can.
Thank you.
And I was chuckling at Kirby's comment there.
Volunteers tribute. Yeah, I was just sending a note saying I'll do an e-introduction, and as I was typing, I typed like e-transfer. I don't think I'm doing e-transfer. I will do an e-introduction. Kirby, thank you for your keen interest in this. That's great. So Kirby, I'll do an e-introduction for Lori and Rebecca following the session. There was another comment in the chat from Lenore that says, yes, the the reference to Indigenous knowledge, I think, legally documents our voice. So thank you for that intervention as well, Lenore. And then there was one question from Jim in the chat as well, and then perhaps we'll just address this last question, and then we'll turn back to Dr. Point for closing. So maybe if you wanted to speak to the question and then provide any final kind of thoughts, Lori and Rebecca. But there is other legislation currently intended to include Indigenous knowledge, like federal emissions target standards. How can and will these be combined? And I'll note too that there's other like Indigenous knowledge policy frameworks too that have come out of different government departments, particularly the Impact Assessment Agency has developed an Indigenous knowledge policy framework. So perhaps how can all of those be aligned?
Yes, so we are aware of the Impact Assessment Agency's Indigenous Knowledge Framework. I think that's what kind of inspired the idea for this SEPA framework. But maybe as we start working on this framework, we realize that we don't need as specific a SEPA knowledge framework, but maybe it could be more applicable to other acts as well, or other initiatives or other standards, other regulations, I guess. But it also, like, we want to make sure, because this right to a healthy environment has specific duties within this one act, like making sure that it's really tailored to SEPA, and maybe it's a part or a chapter of something, but I think we're really open to and being as flexible as possible. But we see definitely a need to have it for SEPA, whether it's within a broader framework that also includes other acts or a standalone.
And I'll just add, I think some of the work we're doing internally as we explore this idea, and then as we're thinking about it, is to sort of look at what's already being done, like what different knowledges there are already within our departments, in terms of like how people are fulfilling requirements that are there in other acts. And so, I know ECCC has an Indigenous Science Division, and so there's also folks that we've talked to about the work that they're doing and the guidance that they're providing for kind of Environment Canada, more broadly than just SEPA. But yeah, echo what Lori says about we'll kind of see how it evolves a little bit as well.
Thank you. Could you, just note too that Lenore had offered to kind of follow up with the two of you and volunteer to continue work on this. So I'll do the introduction for the rest of you as well, if you don't already know each other. But are there any final comments that you wanted to make, Gloria and Rebecca, before we turn back to Dr. Point for our closing and thank everyone for their contributions?
Yes, I first wanted to say thank you, Andrea, and the team at AFN for suggesting this forum and doing all the organization. We really appreciate the space and the opportunity to have this really great dialogue. And I know it's just the initial conversations, and for many of you, it might have been the first time to hear about the implementation framework, but we're also equally excited to have one-on-one conversations and have those e-invites coming our way. So like, this is our file that we're working on full time right now. And so happy to have as many conversations and involve as many nations and people as possible. So thank you for the great feedback already. And we're also hoping that we get written submissions, or we can have more in-depth conversations on nation-to-nation basis, hopefully before January, as we'll have to start working on finalizing the framework. But again, really appreciate, and I always learn so much and am humbled with the feedback that we get. So I appreciate it, and thank you very much. And Rebecca, did you have anything?
I feel like you covered it all, Lori, but I'll just echo everything you're saying, and thanks everybody here for being here, spending the time with us, and we look forward to future conversations.
Thank you. Dr. Point, we'll turn ourselves over to you for any closing words that you wanted to offer, and any closing prayer that you'd be willing to share with us. And thank you